today we have decided to do something a bit different. We are taking a bit of a break from going through once more, checking things like the results in the raid, the results in Mythic Plus keys, the meta, the rankings of the specs, the best DPS, etc, etc. Instead, we go for something a bit new and a bit spicy, which is how bad are players, or alternatively how bad are specs. Because what we are looking at for today is the deaths of players in the raid. Or you could alternatively see this as how likely is each spec to die on any given pull. This could be because the spec is bad, the spec is just squishy and more likely to die, or maybe the players playing a certain spec happen to be bad and they end up dying more than another spec that could be, equally, for example, tanky or equally mobile, yet that spec is dying way less. At first, we are looking at the deaths in Mythic raiding for all kills and all wipes, so basically any given pull, whether it is pull 5 of Dimensius or pull 150 of Dimensius, for all players, just on average the deaths of all players. Obviously, if you're asking, hold on a second, if it's a wipe, isn't everyone going to die? Obviously there is a death cutoff. I believe after 5 deaths all the following deaths are counted as a wipe, so they won't count in the death chance. Now, logically you would be thinking, even in a wipe, the chances of the players to die the least should be the tanks, right? Usually they should be the ones dying the least. Initially it looks like this, because in terms of deaths you have Brewmaster, Blood DK, Plot Warrior, Vengeance and Guardian Druid. So you have the first 5 tanks indeed are the least likely to die. However, what you have after is not the 6th of the tanks, Prot Paladin. You instead have Frost DK and Unholy DK. This has been a staple at this point, a classic in these death statistics, these death chances. Unholy and Frost tend to be quite low in their death percentage quite often, due to their quite large array of possible defensive tools, whether it is the anti-magic shell, the Icebound Fortitude, the Leechborn, and even more likely sometimes the ability to negate mechanics with things like Death's Advance, which even now is relevant. For example, in Nexus King, when you get pulled up, knocked up by the boss, the DKs can just Death's Advance and continue moving like nothing happened. It has made them essentially near tank level of tankiness in raids. Now, there is another spec next to them, which doesn't make too much sense, and it's why we have to put the asterisk there, which is Holy Priest. Now, Holy Priest doesn't strike you exactly as a very tanky spec, or not even as a very mobile spec for them to avoid the danger. The reason why they have been traditionally very low is ever since Restitution became basically a staple talent in the raid. The fact that they can turn into their Spirit of Redemption and then resurrect, which you might have seen yourself multiple times in a raid, means that they can still technically leave a wipe, since the player is still not counted as dead while they are in Spirit of Redemption. Funnily enough, it is if you're doing the hard mode Tazavesh. If you actually go into Spirit of Redemption as a Holy Priest, it still counts as a death, but not in Warcraft logs and not in a raid. What this means is, if you're wiping and then you die as a Holy Priest, you get into Spirit of Redemption, the boss resets, Spirit of Redemption ends, and you resurrect yourself, it doesn't count as a death. That's what keeps Holy Priest being this low, basically next to the other tanks. The only tank above them is Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin is roughly 20% more likely to die than the other tanks, although it's still a reasonably small percentage, 4% in total. Above them, you have other notoriously tanky specs you would have expected, like Outlaw and Subrogue. You also have Demo, Destro, quite low down in their death chance, and the Shamans, Resto and Elemental. Resto and Elemental do have also essentially the much worse version of Restitution of Holy Priest, which is Ankh. Ankh is also counted by Warcraft logs as an actual defensive, as a personal for yourself, so if you do die and you rest with Ankh, it's still not counted as a death. it's basically a much worse version of proccing a cheat death of, say, a Friar Mage. So they are reasonably low down in their death rate compared to the other specs. There are some question marks. For example, while you see Arcane, Frost and Fire all next to each other, right? So they are like, well, they are the same spec. They're all dying at the same rate. It's not that one certain spec of mage is being played by better players, so they die less. This one is a bit interesting because Fire, unlike the other two, does have an actual cheat death. And yet their death chance is just about the same as the other two mages that don't have a cheat death. What is perhaps a bit more interesting is why are Demo and Destro dying less than Affliction? Despite not, unlike Fire Mage with a cheat death, Affliction doesn't have anything worse than Demo and Destro, yet it dies a bit more than them. Same for Enhancement. Resto Shaman and Elemental Shaman do die quite a bit less than Enhancement. This could be the difference between ranged and melee. Perhaps being melee causes you to be more likely to die. However, as we keep going up the ranks of your chances to die, we will see that this is not really the case. Now, our first spec on actual fraud watch could be Assassination, because Sub and Outlaw are significantly less likely to die than Assassination, despite having the identical defense mechanisms of the class of Rogue, particularly things like Evasion, Cloak, as well as Feint, arguably the best, most consistent defensive in the game. Sub and Outlaw do get more leech, do get more self-healing than an Assassination can, but self-healing likely not the reason why Assassination dies almost 35% more than their other two specs in the same class. Perhaps the very simple answer is Assassination players are worse. The best answer is Assassination is good now, players are rerolling to Assassination and they're not nearly as good and they die, maybe. When you stretch up the rankings, is what we said about the difference between melees and ranged, you see that the worse the top, you have Shadow Priest, Devastation, Discipline, Augmentation, Balanced Druid, Windwalker, Preservation, and BM. So basically all casters, minus Windwalker. You do have all three of the Evoker specs next to each other, close to each other. So interesting, practically the squishiest of the classes would be, based on this, would be Druid, Priest, and Evoker. Once you take away the cheat death mechanic of Holy Priest, they would also be joining these high ranks. So Priest, Druid, and Evoker are the squishiest specs in the raid, dying nearly 50% of the times on every wipe before the wipe is called, before you're actually wiping. It is quite surprising for Evoker given how mobile they can be, how easily they can get themselves out of danger. Their defensives are not spectacular, only a couple of charges of Obsidian Blaze. You have the self-healing of Renewing Blaze that can also be useful. In the case of Preservation, you yourself are also a healer, so you should have better ways to save yourself, self-heal yourself, as well as the extra added time dilation external you can still use on yourself, yet your deaths are quite high, almost a Discipline Priest level, which is quite surprising since Disc, unlike Preservation, is much less mobile and much more in danger of dangerous mechanics in the raid. No surprise for Balance, who has been in the top most likely to die for several expansions now. The difference between Windwalker and Mistweaver is a bit interesting. They are both technically pseudo-melee, even though nowadays Mistweaver is playing with a build that is just a normal caster that can play at range. But what if you were to look at actually good players, actually high-level players, the death percentages of the top, I guess, the top logs in Mythic raiding. So first you can see that the death chance on average already goes down from 50% average at the top to like 26% at the very highest, so it basically is cut in half. But the position of the specs do stay pretty consistent. You do have the priests still high up, The Evokers still high up, Balanced Druid still high up, Windwalker still far higher up than Mistweaver. You do have, as we mentioned, the visible now difference in mages. Now the cheat death of Fire Mage is showing up as being more efficient than the other two mages who are dying more. You still have the tanks at the very bottom. This time they are all nice 6 in a row. But still, as you can see, with a visible difference between Prot Paladin and the other tanks. You still have the 2 DPS DKs as the tankiest DPS specs, followed by Outlaw and Sub, who are the next second tankiest class, with still the odd gap between Sub, Outlaw, and then Assassination much higher up once more. So even amongst the top 25% of logs of kills for the bosses, Assassination is still way more likely to die than the 2 other rogues. Now, if you were looking to actively blame players who almost ruined your kill pools, so only looking at the deaths of players during an actual kill. So if you're killing the boss, the chances of each of these specs to actually die, so it's no longer the average across the 40 pools you took to kill Soul Hunters, but only the 41st pool, the actual kill pool of the boss. There are a couple of interesting changes. First, obviously, Fire Mage drops much lower down, because obviously this is the kill pool and Fire Mage has a cheat death. So the chances that you die in a single pool through a cheat death a second time becomes much lower. So you now have Fire Mage now significantly lower than both of the other mage specs. You still have the tanks very low, but again, Prot Paladin is still higher up. There are, again, the DKs, the DPS DKs quite low, the rogues are still very low, of course Holy Priest is still very low, and Prot Paladin dies actually more than twice as much as the other tanks in your kill pools. It is still quite surprising to see the difference between Mistweaver and Windwalker even on kill pools. 37% chance to die Windwalkers in a kill pool, so more than 1 in 3 chances every time you kill a boss for a Windwalker to be dead. The Hunters also very high, basically 1 in 3 pools. One of the Hunters will be dead. We haven't touched on this yet, but it's nice to touch on this now since it's way more visible. Warriors. Fury, who used to be pretty low, is now sort of middle of the pack, but Arms. Arms is the 3rd most likely to die during a kill pool as far as DPS go. Arms doesn't really have any extra squishiness, really, compared to Fury Warrior, yet it dies significantly more than a Fury Warrior. 13% flat chance to die and over like a 50% increase from the 25% chance of Fury. It is interesting because when you're trying to find a reason for all of these numbers, you would be wondering, well, the first one is Shadow Priest, and it makes sense because they are super immobile. So they can be, screwed by mechanics when they have to move a lot, especially, for example, maybe even Soul Hunters, since they will often be one of the carriers of the debuff, they are more likely to die. It kind of makes sense. But then you have Devastation, which is much more mobile than Shadow Priest. So why are they dying so much? Is it the shorter range, perhaps? Maybe only their 2 charges of the defensive, perhaps? Even then, why are they dying more than Balanced Druid? They're definitely tankier than a Balanced Druid, yet they die that much more. So is it because they are bad? Is it because Devastation Evoker players are just naturally worse players than some of the other casters? And to finish with this question, just in case there was some major outlier between the average player base and the top level ones, if you look at the wipes, so only the wipes and only amongst the top 10% of players. So the numbers again go down much more. They are much lower in average. Yet the players here would still more or less keep the same level. You still have Shadow Priest as your highest death spec. You still have Devastation still there. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at the wipes only, the kills only, the wipes and the kills. All players, top 10% players, doesn't matter. Shadow Priest is here at the top, Devastation, Beast Mastery, all of the Evokers really, Marksmanship, Balanced Druid, they are still always there. You do have bigger swings amongst the middle of the pack, like we mentioned Arms being very high for the kills, and then you look at the wipes, Arms is now average in death rate. We mentioned things staying the same at the top with these classes like priests and evokers and druids even dying a lot. At the bottom is the same, even with these top level players. You have the DPS decays. You have the rogues without assassination, which continues to die more. And then you have the warlocks, which remain the tankier ones, and then the shamans, because of their Ankh, giving them just an extra layer of death prevention, with the extra asterisks, where Mistweaver dies much less than the melee Windwalker, and then Resto and Elemental die less than their melee Enhancement Shaman. Those are the two distinctions between casters and melees. Maybe there is a reason there. Playing melees, for those classes at least, causes you to die way more often. This is what we have been observing for today, just for curiosity, to check out, you know, how likely you are to die. So next time you're gonna go and raid and go into a boss, if you were playing, for example, Shadow Priest, just know that if you're about to wipe, you have like a 40% chance to be the one who actually dies before the wipe, compared to only having some 10% chance of dying before a wipe if you were playing like a Frost Decay, for example. This is what we wanted to observe for today on this Saturday. Death. That's right, we wanted to keep it cheery and happy for this weekend, talking about death, with a possible sprinkle of humiliation, laughter and bullying towards the specs that die the most, either because the spec itself is bad or possibly because the players playing the spec are bad themselves. I will let you make the distinction between the two, which one it is. But for today though, on this Saturday, this is all we had to look over. With this out of the way, we can now leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, P. It had to happen 25 minutes ago before I started the video, and then I kept going and going and going, just holding it in. It's time to go.